Hi Fox Nation, I'm Kristen Soltis Anderson and welcome to What Are the Odds? As Democratic candidates seek to unite their party, are there key demographic coalitions dividing them? Plus, polling shows Bernie Sanders leading the pack among younger Democrats, and Biden pulling ahead with older voters in the party. So just how wide is the generation gap? Plus, Mayor Pete Buttigieg is polling next to zero support from minority voters. In a field of demographically divided candidates, who can unite their party? Let's look at the odds. Joining me now to break it all down is John Rowley, Democratic strategist and founder of CounterPoint Messaging. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning.
So before I dive into the demographic groups in the Democratic primary, I want to start off by talking about the big news that broke overnight, which was the United States saying that it has taken out Iran's General Soleimani. We've got some reaction from some of the Democratic candidates for president. Joe Biden saying President Trump just tossed a stick of dynamite into a tinderbox. Elizabeth Warren saying this reckless move escalates the situation with Iran. Bernie Sanders saying this brings us closer to another disastrous war in the Middle East. So obviously taking a position that this was not the right move to make. But as that's still a very evolving story, the one thing we do know is this is going to elevate the importance of national security, foreign policy in this Democratic contest, which it has not been a central issue thus far. Mostly these debates have been about things like healthcare, et cetera. So with national security inevitably now moving higher up in that priority list, taking center stage, do you see this changing the Democratic primary contest at all? Is there any candidate that you think benefits from this being an issue that's more in the spotlight?
Well, they're talking about legitimate policy differences and approach on foreign policy. I don't know that the politics, that this has a dramatic impact. I think this has a dramatic impact if there's a domino effect in the Middle East and some other horrible things happen as a result. But I think there's a good chance this could be a blip. I mean, you could make a case. Vice President Biden has pretty significant foreign policy experience as vice president. That's why he was picked to be vice president. He has a little bit of an advantage, but I think also when it comes to foreign policy, Democratic primary voters are just a little frothy about anything that's anti-Trump. So there will also be a lane for whoever's the most strident or tough on Trump as well. So it may create opportunity for multiple candidates because we still have, a football team left.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's talk a little bit about that race to win the Democratic nomination and the different demographic groups at play. One of the big divides that we're seeing in the polls is along generational lines. If you take a look at polling of Democratic primary voters, those who are 18 to 29 really gravitate toward Bernie Sanders. 28% saying he is their top choice, according to the Harvard Institute of Politics poll. Second place was Elizabeth Warren. Joe Biden only coming in at 16 points. However, when you look at the flip side of the equation, Joe Biden does quite well among Democratic voters aged 45 and up. He wins 40% of them, according to Fox News' polling. Bernie Sanders only coming in at 10%. So given this really big generational gap, first I want to talk about the Bernie Sanders piece of this. He clearly has a very loyal, very excited piece of the party that is young and progressive. But most Democratic primary voters are not under the age of 45, are not very far to the left. So has Bernie Sanders backed himself into a corner by having very deep but very narrow support with just sort of one piece of the Democratic coalition?
Possibly. I mean, some of the most vocal, most tweeted voters in the Democratic primary are not the biggest part of the electorate. And so, Bernie Sanders' numbers are largely a carryover from the 2016 race and what he's done since then, where he was an alternative to Hillary Clinton, who never really resonated with younger voters. But you make an interesting point. Some of the polls that have been released are fascinating because it's almost like there are 4 or 5 primaries going on demographically in addition to all the different states. We have African American vote, the Latino vote, how things are going with women of different ages, the younger vote, and they're very different races based on that. Vice President Biden is doing well across all lines, and like you mentioned, anybody that's done a Democratic primary, whether it's city council in Los Angeles or something in the rural South, knows that the overwhelming majority of Democratic primary voters are 45 to 85, like in most primaries, and so I think that's where the bread is buttered. And but you know, I mean, Bernie Sanders is. There was also another poll from Axios that came out that said he had grown among college students, and I think So I think overall, demographically, in terms of the youth vote, it kind of confuses the presidential race. I do think from that Axios poll, one thing that was interesting, only 17% of college students were for President Trump. So I think that bodes poorly for the future of the Republican Party.
Now, certainly, as you mentioned, Joe Biden's coalition within the Democratic Party is a little bit broader. He does well with older Democrats. He does well with African-American Democrats. However, as you mentioned, in 2016, Hillary Clinton struggled with younger Democrats, and that wound up translating to some struggles in the general election. I mean, she won younger voters, but not by perhaps as large a margin as was thought. You have had some really interesting studies in some of these blue wall states of young voters sort of casting protest votes or staying home. So when it comes to Joe Biden, he's putting together a fairly broad coalition within the Democratic Party. But having that weakness among young voters, does that portend any potential real weakness when it comes to the general election if he can't bring them along?
Right. I mean, it's something they should be concerned about, and I'm sure they're going to have some efforts to energize young voters and coalesce them in the general election. I mean, you could take a point that he's in third with younger voters when you have a lot of other candidates that are of a different generation, so you might see that as good news. I mean, I think the ace in the hole for Democrats is 83% of college students right now wouldn't vote for Trump, and so I think Trump may unify them as much as passion for whoever the nominee is.
Well, polls are not everything, which kills me to say as a pollster, but money is also fairly important when it comes to looking at who's got momentum and energy. Fourth quarter campaign fundraising numbers have been coming out. President Trump posting a $46 million haul. Bernie Sanders with a pretty eye-popping figure, $34.5 million. And then Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, at almost $25 million, outpacing supposed frontrunner Joe Biden, whose haul was less than $23 million. I want to talk a little bit about Mayor Pete here for a moment, because nationally in the polls, he still tends to be in single digits. In early states, certainly doing much better. But he's clearly got a lot of support from those who are willing to write checks. What do you make of all of this money that's going to Mayor Pete? And is this giving him the potential for a real springboard headed into Iowa and beyond?
Yeah, by any standard, he's running an exceptional campaign. And like you said, polling is one measure. The thing polling and anybody that wants to prognosticate can't measure is momentum. And we've definitely seen presidential races. If somebody gets a win or two under their belt, dominoes fall in their direction. And so if he can win Iowa and hang on there, what does that mean for New Hampshire and some of these later states, to some of the Latino, African-American voters, older voters that he's in, third, fourth, fifth place with? Do they give him a second look? Once we get to Iowa, it's kind of playoff time. A lot of sports fans don't tune into the playoffs. I think even your most informed, passionate primary voters, a lot of them aren't going to totally tune in until we get right up to Iowa or right after Iowa, and even a lot of them like all of these candidates. It's not like if they're with Biden or Elizabeth Warren, they don't like Mayor Pete or Cory Booker. I mean, most of these candidates are liked, and so that's why there could be some flopping around between different candidates that they like, because they all have approval ratings in the 60s to the 80s.
Another fundraising figure that I thought was completely fascinating is Andrew Yang bringing in $16.5 million in the last quarter. A huge figure for someone who's really just come on the national scene as of the last year. But also a big separation there between big fundraising hauls, but still only around 3% or so in the polls, still trying to make sure that he can qualify for these next debates. But you can put a lot of ads on television with $16.5 million. How seriously should political observers be taking the Yang Gang?
Well, I think you ought to take anybody that raises $17 million in a quarter seriously. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a factor in the Democratic Party going forward. I mean, it's hard to find where he gets the oxygen to break out of this field of a lot of people with strong polling and fundraising numbers, but they're a real factor, and I think the Democrats have really revolutionized how political fundraising is done. It's one way that I think the president's, his strength has been the billion-dollar brand he brought to the table when he ran, and so he really didn't have to raise and spend that much money before, and I think the Republicans are a little lax in their fundraising. The way Democrats are doing online fundraising, almost every campaign is, I think the Republicans are losing that arms race right now, and that could be a big factor in the general election.
Well, let's wrap by talking about some other important pieces of the Democratic coalition, specifically Black and Latino voters. So polling now shows Joe Biden continuing to do extremely well among Black voters, 51% among Democratic primary voters who are African American. Mayor Pete only coming in at 2%. Meanwhile, among Latino voters, you actually see Bernie Sanders in pole position among Latino voters. According to Emerson College polling, he's at 36%, with Buttigieg coming in at 0%. How big of a problem is this for Mayor Pete? He's got all of this money, he's got lots of momentum in some of these early states, but when it comes to putting together the full picture of the Democratic coalition, he still seems to be struggling. Does he have a chance to turn that around?
He needs a couple early wins. I mean, what he's got to bet on is that he does well in Iowa and New Hampshire, and he gets a second look. I mean, a lot of those voters do like him, but he's their third, fourth choice right now. So they need to give him a second look. And, maybe there's part of his message that isn't resonating as well. The thing about Democratic primary voters, in particular African American voters, they are also some of the more conservative primary voters. A lot of people very driven by faith, and so I think there's some misconceptions about what really goes into some of the different demographics. But as we outlined, it's almost like there's, in addition to the 4 or 5 states they're competing super hard in with Super Tuesday coming, it's like there's 4 or 5 demographic races going on to slice and dice the primary.
Now, the general election is obviously going to be one where Latino voters, African American voters play a huge role. Projections show that Latino voters will likely be at least 13% of the electorate come 2020. And it's clear that the candidates on the Democratic side all know this, that it's not just important for the primary, but for the general election. Immigration being a very important issue for voters across the political spectrum. Let's take a listen to what Mayor Pete has said about his new immigration plan.
The policy of family separation will permanently end on day one when I'm president. There will be no such thing as a for-profit child detention facility. We need to deal with our reliance on detention in the first place. We need a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented and protecting dreamers. Those are some of the day one things we got to act on, but the reality is we got to fix the system itself. We haven't had a meaningful fix to the immigration system in decades.
Now, I think it's a misconception that people assume that Latino voters are primarily motivated by immigration. They're motivated by issues like health care, et cetera. But by talking about immigration, putting it first and foremost, is this going to potentially be an effective strategy for Mayor Pete as he tries to build a more diverse coalition of voters?
It's a first building block. But I think if we both studied the history of presidential politics, I don't know that there's like the thermonuclear policy paper that broke someone out of the pack. So I think this is kind of the barrier to entry, and then I think messaging and connection with those voters is the next step. And so I think it's probably a necessary piece. It's similar to what a lot of the other candidates have said, frankly, but it's definitely something he has to focus on some. And then the fine balance with any demographic group or any voter is you need to speak to them without pandering to them. And so I think that's the balance his team has to strike, and it's a challenge. But they've been working on it for a while, and it's like in the playoffs. Nothing beats winning. If he gets a win, I think it's an entirely different race for him. If he doesn't have any momentum going into New Hampshire or out of New Hampshire, then then he's probably going to be one of the great fundraising candidates of all time who comes in third or fourth.
I've never gone wrong when in politics, sort of operating from the mantra that everybody loves a winner. John, thank you so much for joining me.